there is a set of 7 clay tablets in room 55 of the British Museum that contains, near its end, a sequence of names. Tablets are catalogued as the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian poem of creation. The 7th tablet, the final tablet, approximately 15 centimetres across, at its widest preserved fragment, and it lists 50 names by which the god Marduk was acknowledged after his victory over the older powers. Tablets were recovered from the ruined library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, in what is now northern Iraq. The excavation was led by Henry Layard and continued by Hormuzd Rassam in the 1850s. The cuneiform script on the 7th tablet dates physical object to approximately 650 BCE. The text itself is older, and what one of those names appears to do. The one that gives Marduk authority over the breath, the mind, the obedient body of mankind, is what we are going to spend the next 90 minutes examining. The Enuma Elish is a long poem. It runs to roughly 1,000 lines of Akkadian cuneiform spread across 7 tablets, each tablet a fired clay rectangle held in a single hand. The standard scholarly edition reconstructs the text from multiple recovered copies. The British Museum holds the most complete set. Other fragments are housed at the Vatican Apostolic Archive, at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and in the Yale Babylonian Collection. Poem opens with the famous line, "When on high the heavens had not been named," and proceeds through the birth of the gods, the rebellion of Tiamat, the elevation of Marduk as champion, and finally the creation of humanity from the blood of a slain rebel god named Kingu. What concerns us tonight is not the cosmology. It is the last 2 tablets. After Marduk has defeated Tiamat and ordered the cosmos, the assembled gods give him names. The poem says there are 50 of them. The 50 names are not random epithets. Each one is presented as a transfer of a specific power. One name gives Marduk authority over the grain, another over the rain, another over the rivers, another over the lots that determine human fate. The poem treats the names as instruments. When the name is spoken, power named is activated. 3 of those 50 names cluster together in a particular way. They are presented in sequence. They are explicitly tied to the regulation of the human creature that has just been created in the previous tablet. And the Akkadian text gives, in each case, both the name and a brief gloss on what the name does to the human body and mind. The conventional reading is that these are religious incantations, words of devotion, a liturgical recitation in which the priest, by reciting the 50 names, ritually reaffirms the kingship of Marduk over the cosmos. This is the reading defended by the great Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer, by A. Leo Oppenheim in his foundational synthesis Ancient Mesopotamia, and more recently by Stephanie Dalley of Oxford in her standard translation Myths from Mesopotamia. The alternative reading, which we will examine in detail, is different. It argues that the Sumerian morphemes underlying the Akkadian text, the syllables en, mu, mi, are not poetic abstractions. They are described in the older Sumerian sources as specific utterances that the Anunnaki, the older gods, were said to deploy as functional sound. The author Zecharia Sitchin's translation work on these texts spans the books published between 1976 and the late 2000s. Host argued that the Mesopotamian scribes were describing something much more concrete than liturgy. He argued they were describing sound used as a behavioral control mechanism over the human being, a spoken command that, issued at the correct frequency by the correct authority, produced a measurable change in the listener. That reading has not been formally refuted. It has been dismissed as fringe by mainstream Assyriology, but a peer-reviewed counterpaper has yet engaged with the specific linguistic case Sitchin made for those 3 syllables. Text is still in the British Museum. The translations are published. the question is still open. Find that the academic literature on texts like the Enuma Elish has been incomplete. If you suspect there are tablets sitting in museum, drawers, waiting for someone to read them not as poetry but as record, this channel is for that work. Subscribe, only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. To understand why the alternative reading matters, we need to understand the mainstream reading on its own terms, fairly stated. The mainstream reading of the Enuma Elish is the product of more than a century of careful philological work. Henry Layard's excavations at Kuyunjik, the mound that covers ancient Nineveh, began in the 1840s. His successor, Hormuzd Rassam, continued through the 1850s. Tablets they recovered were shipped to the British Museum, where they were sorted, baked for stability, and slowly translated. First scholar to publish a coherent translation of the Enuma Elish was George Smith, a young engraver turned Assyriologist, who is best remembered for his 1872 announcement of the Flood Tablet. Smith died young, 1876, but the work he began was continued by a succession of scholars across the late 19th and 20th centuries. Stephen Langdon, who would later become better known for his translation of the Weld Blundell Prism at the Ashmolean, and contributed early readings. Samuel Noah. Kramer placed the text within the broader Sumerian literary corpus from which much of its imagery was inherited. Leo Oppenheim integrated it into the cultural history of Mesopotamia. The mainstream reading is straightforward. The Enuma Elish is a Babylonian theological poem composed, in its present form, sometime in the late 2nd millennium BCE, probably around the reign of Nebuchadnezzar I, in the 12th century BCE. Its function was political and liturgical. It justified the elevation of Marduk, the god of the city of Babylon, over the older gods of the Sumerian pantheon. It was recited annually during the Akitu festival, the New Year festival in Babylon, in which the king reenacted Marduk's victory over chaos. The 50 names of Marduk in this reading are an act of synthesis, by assigning to Marduk every divine function previously held by separate gods: the storm god, the grain god, the river god, god of fate. The priests of Babylon consolidated the older theology under their own patron. The recitation was, in essence, a theological merger document. The 50 names absorbed 50 independent traditions. In this reading, the 3 names that interest us, those associated with regulation of the human creature, are absorbed older epithets of gods who once had authority over particular aspects of human existence. The syllable N was the standard Sumerian word for lord, used as a title for senior deities and senior priests. The syllable mu was a noun meaning name, or word, or year. The syllable mi was the technical Sumerian term for a divine decree, an ordinance, a fundamental ordering principle of the cosmos. These 3 terms, in the mainstream reading, are abstractions. N is an honorific, mu is a grammatical category. Mi is a theological concept comparable to the Greek logos or the Hebrew davar. Priests of Babylon recited the names of Marduk and invoked his authority through in and mu and mi. They were doing what priests have always done. They were affirming order. They were not, in this reading, describing a technology. Stephanie Daly's translation, which remains the standard accessible English edition, renders these passages with the careful neutrality that mainstream philology requires. The names are translated as names. Grammar is translated as grammar. Where the underlying Sumerian is ambiguous, Daly leaves it ambiguous in the English. The reading is conservative because the evidence the mainstream view holds permits no other reading. That is the orthodox case, fairly stated. It is the case that any honest examination of the alternative reading must engage with. The mainstream reading is not stupid. It is the product of careful accumulated work by serious scholars. The question we are asking is not whether the mainstream reading is wrong. The question is whether it is complete. The break in the conventional reading came in stages. It did not arrive as a single thunderclap. It arrived as a slow accumulation of textual observations made by researchers who were willing to take the Sumerian morphemes more literally than mainstream Assyriology was willing to take them. The first stage was the work of Zecharia Sitchin. Sitchin was born in the Russian Empire in 1920, raised in Mandatory Palestine, trained in economic history at the London School of Economics. He was not, and never claimed to be, a credentialed Assyriologist. He was, by his own account, a self-taught reader of Sumerian and Akkadian who began his serious work on the cuneiform corpus in the 1950s, and published his first book, The 12th Planet, in 1976. The book sold widely. It also drew immediate professional dismissal. We will come to that. What Sitchin argued, in summary, was that the Sumerian texts were not myth in the modern sense. They were record. The Anunnaki, gods of the older Sumerian pantheon, were not abstractions. They were a population of physical beings whose interactions with early humanity were described by the scribes with a precision that mainstream translators had systematically softened. Sitchin's method was to take the Sumerian morphemes at their face value. Where mainstream translators would render a word as a poetic metaphor, Sitchin would ask what the word literally said. His reading of the syllable mu is the most famous example. The word mu appears in dozens of Sumerian and Akkadian contexts. The standard scholarly translation is name, or that which is named, by extension year, because years were named after their kings. Sitchin argued that in certain technical contexts, particularly those describing the ascent of gods to the heavens, mu referred not to a name but to a physical vehicle, what he interpreted as a sky, chamber, or rocket. The argument was treated as absurd by professional Sumerologists, but Sitchin's point about mu as a sound, as an utterance with operational consequence, was a different argument, and that argument has been less examined. In the Enuma Elish, in the passages where Marduk is given the name Mu, the text says that by this name he commands the breath of the human being. The breath. The Akkadian word used is napishtu, which can mean breath, life force, or throat. Mainstream translation reads this metaphorically. Marduk has authority over human life. Sitchin read it literally. By the utterance mu, issued at the correct register, the deity could modulate the breathing of the listener. The second stage of the break came with the work of Mauro Biglino. Biglino is an Italian biblical scholar who served for approximately 30 years as a translator of ancient Hebrew for the Vatican's publishing house, the Edizioni San Paolo. His translations of the Old Testament were issued with full ecclesiastical approval. After his retirement, beginning in the late 2000s, Biglino began publishing independently. His argument was that the Hebrew word Elohim, conventionally translated as God, was in the underlying text a plural noun referring to physical beings comparable in description to the Sumerian Anunnaki. Biglino's books are sold in Italian bookshops, including academic ones. They have not been engaged with substantively in peer-reviewed Hebrew scholarship. Biglino's contribution to the question of the three sounds was indirect but important. He observed that the Old Testament contains multiple passages in which the voice of Yahweh produces direct physical effects on listeners. The Israelites at Sinai cannot bear the sound and beg Moses to intercede. The priests at certain ritual events fall down. The walls of Jericho fall to a coordinated acoustic event. Biglino argued that these passages were not metaphors. They were descriptions of an acoustic technology that the Old Testament editors no longer fully understood but faithfully preserved. The third stage of the break is more recent and comes from outside the Assyriological mainstream. A small body of work, published primarily in the early 2000s by researchers at the intersection of acoustic engineering and ancient studies, has examined the possibility that certain ancient ritual spaces, including the inner chambers of Mesopotamian ziggurats, the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid at Giza, and certain Maltese hypogea, produce measurable resonance effects in the human body at specific frequencies. The Hal Saflieni hypogeum on the island of Malta has been measured to resonate at approximately 110 Hz frequency that in laboratory studies has been associated with altered brain activity in the prefrontal cortex of listeners. Connection drawn by the alternative reading is this. The Sumerian texts describe 3 syllables of power. The Akkadian texts describe what those syllables do to the human body. The architectural record preserves chambers in which sounds at specific frequencies appear to have been deliberately amplified, and the human nervous system is demonstrably modulable by sound at the correct frequency and intensity. The case is not that the Anunnaki existed as Sitchin described them. The case is narrower. It is that the Mesopotamian scribes, when they wrote that certain spoken syllables produced specific effects on the breath, the mind, and the obedience of the listener, may have been describing something they had observed. Not imagined, observed. This is not a fringe case in the wild sense. Sitchin made it in print over 4 decades. Biglino made it from inside the Vatican translation office. The acoustic researchers made it with instrumentation. The case has been built. It has not been refuted. It has been ignored. Sitchin and Biglino are not fringe figures in the cartoon sense. Sitchin held a degree from a serious British university. Biglino held an institutional position at the Vatican for 3 decades. They worked in print. They cited their sources. Their books are in libraries. The acoustic researchers publish in conference proceedings. None of this is hidden. None of this is invented. The texts are in the British Museum. Translations are on the shelves. The chambers are open to visitors who want to measure them. The conventional reading has not done is engage with a specific overlap. It has not produced a peer-reviewed paper that takes the 3 named syllables, examines the Akkadian gloss that accompanies each, examines the acoustic properties of the spaces in which they were recited, and explains why the consistency is coincidental. The paper has not been written. The question remains, as it has been since the 1850s, open. What it means, if the alternative reading is even partially correct, is something we should sit with carefully. The implication is not small. The implication is that the founding civilization of the ancient Near East, the Sumerians and their Akkadian inheritors, preserved, in their canonical creation poem, a description of a behavioral technology that operated through sound, must be precise about what would and would not follow. What would follow, at minimum, is that the scribes of Babylon understood the human nervous system to be modulable by acoustic input, in a way that mainstream histories of cognitive science do not credit pre-modern cultures with understanding. What would follow is that the 3 syllables in, mu, mi, recited in the Akkadian rituals of the Akitu festival and elsewhere, were not arbitrary phonemes chosen for poetic balance, selected for measurable effect. What would not follow, and what we are not arguing, is that the Anunnaki existed as Sitchin described them, or that any specific extraterrestrial hypothesis is established by the textual record. The narrower claim is enough. The narrower claim is sufficient to require a rewrite of how we understand the cognitive sophistication of the 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE. First cross-cultural parallel arrives quickly when we look outside Mesopotamia. The Vedic tradition of the Indian subcontinent, preserved in the Rig Veda, the oldest of the 4 Vedas, dated by mainstream Indology to approximately 1500 BCE in its compiled form but with oral antecedents reaching deeper, contains a detailed theology of sound. The Vedic concept is called bija, meaning seed. Bija mantra is a single syllable, or short combination of syllables, treated by the tradition as a phonological unit that produces a specific effect when uttered correctly. The most famous bija is om, also written as aum, but the tradition catalogues several dozen others. The Vedic priests, like the Babylonian priests, treated the human voice as an instrument that could, by precise modulation, produce measurable changes in the body and mind of the listener. The Vedic tradition is not a transmitted version of the Mesopotamian tradition. The two cultures were geographically separated by approximately 3,000 kilometers, and by the formidable barrier of the Iranian plateau. There is no evidence of direct textual transmission. And yet, the two traditions, independently, developed a theology of operational sound. Independent attestation across cultures is, in the standard methodology of comparative religion, treated as evidence that the underlying observation is real, or at minimum that the two cultures responded to something they both observed in human, acoustic experience. The Egyptian parallel is closer in geography but no less striking. The pyramid texts of Unas, carved into the inner chambers of the pyramid of the pharaoh Unas at Saqqara, around 2350 BCE, the oldest substantial religious texts from ancient Egypt. The texts contain a category of utterance called hika, conventionally translated as magic, but more accurately rendered as authoritative speech. Hika was personified as a deity in its own right. The Egyptian theological position was that Hika was the underlying force by which the gods had spoken the world into being, and by which the spoken word, correctly uttered by an authorized speaker, retained authority over the structure of reality. The pyramid texts include detailed phonological instructions for the recitation of certain spells. The priest is told not just what to say, but how to say it. The breath, the pitch, the duration are specified. If you want to check this for yourself, pyramid texts of Unas have been translated multiple times into English, most accessibly by Raymond Faulkner in 1969 and, more recently, by James Allen of Brown University in the early 2000s. Pyramid itself is open to visitors at Saqqara, south of Cairo. The texts are carved on the walls. They are not hidden. The translations are in any university library. This is the geographic spread that matters. Mesopotamian texts originate at sites including Nineveh, in what is now northern Iraq, earlier at Nippur and in the south of present-day Iraq. The Egyptian texts originate at Saqqara, about 30 kilometers south of modern Cairo. Vedic texts originate in the Indus-Sarasvati region of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, with later compilation in the Gangetic Plain. Three civilizations, separated by thousands of kilometers, each preserving a theology of operational sound, each treating the human voice as an instrument that could modulate the listener. The chain of consequences, if this overlap is not coincidence, substantial. Conventional cognitive history places the systematic study of the human nervous system in the 19th and 20th centuries CE, for the work of figures like Hermann von Helmholtz, on auditory perception in the 1860s, and Ivan Pavlov, on conditioned response at the turn of the 20th century. If the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Vedic priesthoods were operating from a practical knowledge of acoustic effect on the nervous system, even an incomplete and ritually couched knowledge, then the standard timeline is off by approximately 3,500 years. That is a substantial revision. It does not by itself support any Anunnaki hypothesis, but it does support the narrower claim that the ancient priesthoods possessed a body of practical phonological knowledge that mainstream cognitive history has not credited them with. There is more. Within the Mesopotamian tradition itself, three syllables do not appear only in the Enuma Elish. They appear in the Maklu series, the 8-tablet anti-witchcraft incantation corpus, also recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal. They appear in the Shurpu series, parallel ritual corpus of approximately 9 tablets. They appear in the medical texts, particularly the diagnostic series Sagig, which catalogues several thousand diagnostic observations across approximately 40 tablets. In the medical context, syllables are prescribed for recitation over patients suffering specific conditions. Prescriptions distinguish between syllables to be uttered over the head, the chest, and the belly. The texts are explicit. Physician is to utter a specific sound at a specific point on the body for a specific number of repetitions. The Mesopotamian medical corpus is large. It has been studied in detail by Joanne Scurlock of Elmhurst College, whose translations of the diagnostic and therapeutic texts were published in the 2000s by the Society of Biblical Literature. Scurlock's mainstream conclusion is that the recited syllables were ritual, intended to invoke divine assistance rather than to produce a direct physical effect. The alternative reading agrees that the syllables were ritual, but adds the question Scurlock does not pursue. Why these syllables? Why these locations on the body? Why these repetitions? If the syllables had no operational effect, the choice of syllable should not have mattered. But the texts treat it as mattering greatly. A wrong syllable produced a wrong outcome. This is the kind of textual evidence that the alternative reading rests on, not on dramatic revelations, on the quiet, accumulating pattern of texts that treat sound as functional. The Mesopotamian scribes were not vague about this. They specified. They wrote down which syllable, in which order, at which body location, for which condition. They preserved this information across centuries and through multiple parallel ritual corpora. The geographic anchoring deepens as we look at where these texts were used. Recitations, described in the Enuma Elish, were performed inside the Esagila, the temple of Marduk at Babylon. Ziggurat, known to later Greek travellers as Etemenanki, rose to a reconstructed height of approximately 90 metres, and whose inner sanctum was a small enclosed chamber with stone or fired brick walls. The acoustic properties of small enclosed chambers with hard walls are well understood in modern architectural acoustics. Such chambers produce strong resonance at frequency determined by their dimensions. Chamber of certain dimensions will amplify, by standing wave reinforcement, sounds at specific frequencies by 10 to 20 decibels above their unamplified intensity. We cannot measure the Esagila directly. The temple was destroyed and the bricks reused over centuries. The site, at Babylon, is approximately 90 kilometres south of modern Baghdad, partially excavated and accessible to researchers. But the inner sanctum no longer exists in a form that permits acoustic measurement. We can, however, measure parallel structures. The Halsafliani Hypogeum on Malta, mentioned earlier, is a subterranean temple complex dated to approximately 3600 BCE, earlier than the Enuma Elish, but contemporary with the older Sumerian sources that the Babylonian poem inherited from. The hypogeum has been measured by acoustic engineers and found to amplify male vocal frequencies, particularly in the region of 110 to 114 Hz, by approximately 15 decibels. 110 Hz is approximately the lower range of an adult male speaking voice. A chamber that amplifies that range, in the absence of any other source of sound, will produce in a listener inside the chamber a perceived intensity of male speech, roughly 2 to 3 times what the speaker is producing. Studies published in the early 2000s by a research group including Ian Cook and others associated sustained exposure to sound at this frequency with measurable changes in regional brain activity as observed by electroencephalography. The prefrontal cortex shows reduced activity. The temporal regions associated with intuition and language show altered activity. This is not a fringe finding. It was published in peer-reviewed journals. It was reported in mainstream science press. What has not been done is the further step. No mainstream researcher has yet asked the question: if a chamber built 3,600 years before the present, on a small island in the central Mediterranean, was designed to amplify the human voice at the frequency that modern instrumentation associates with altered brain activity, and if the Mesopotamian texts independently describe specific syllables uttered in specific chambers, producing specific effects on the listener, what is the most parsimonious explanation? The mainstream answer is coincidence. The alternative reading suggests that coincidence is the harder hypothesis, not the easier one. If you want to check the Hal-Saflieni measurements, they are publicly available. The hypogeum is administered by Heritage Malta, the National Heritage Agency. Visits are limited to approximately 10 people per day to preserve the site. But the published acoustic studies are in open scientific literature. Papers can be found in the proceedings of the International Symposium on Music Acoustics and elsewhere. The measurements are not in dispute. The interpretation is. Geography, again, matters. Malta is approximately 3,000 kilometers west of Babylon. The hypogeum is approximately 1,000 years older than the surviving form of the Enuma Elish. Two are not connected by any known direct line of transmission, and yet the same approximate phonological principle appears in both contexts. Chamber, engineered for vocal amplification at a frequency that affects the human nervous system. Ritual text that specifies as the syllables to be uttered in such a chamber. The implication, narrowly stated, that the ancient world possessed a working knowledge of acoustic effects on the human body that the modern reconstruction of ancient cognitive history has not adequately credited. The implication, more broadly stated, is that texts like the Enuma Elish should be reread with a wider range of interpretive possibilities open. The poem is in the British Museum. The translations are available. The chambers are open. The question is what readers of the next generation, including readers without prior commitment to either the mainstream or the alternative reading, will conclude when they engage with the specific overlap rather than dismissing or accepting it in advance. The academic response to this body of work has not been refutation. It has been characterization followed by silence. Zecharia Sitchin's books. The 12th Planet in 1976, The Stairway to Heaven in 1980, Wars of Gods and Men in 1985, and the subsequent volumes through Journeys to the Mythical Past in 2007, sold, by the publisher's own accounting, in the millions of copies across multiple languages. They were reviewed in popular press, plots. They were discussed at conferences of alternative researchers. They were addressed, occasionally, in dismissive paragraphs by mainstream Assyriologists. They were not, at any point across more than 4 decades, the subject of a sustained peer-reviewed refutation that engaged with the specific textual readings Sitchin proposed. Pattern of dismissal is worth examining closely, because the form of the dismissal is itself the evidence. The mainstream Assyriological community did not say, Sitchin's reading of mu mu in line such and such of tablet such and such is incorrect for the following grammatical reasons. The community said, Sitchin is not a credentialed Sumerologist. The community said, Sitchin's overall framework is pseudoscientific. The community said, the popular success of these books should not be confused with scholarly merit. These are characterizations. They are not refutations. Refutation requires engaging with a specific claim. Sitchin's reading of mu as an operational utterance is wrong. The refutation must show, line by line, that the Akkadian gloss on the name does not say what Sitchin says it says. That refutation has not been published. Several scholars have written general critiques. The most often cited is the work of the late Michael Heiser, Hebrew scholar who maintained a website dedicated to engaging with Sitchin. Heiser's critiques are substantive on certain points, particularly the question of the existence of a Sumerian word, transliterated as Nibiru as Sitchin used it. Heiser's critiques do not address the broader phonological argument. The argument that the three syllables een, memu and emi, treated in the Enuma Elish, and the medical corpus as operational, may have been understood by the scribes to produce measurable effects, is not the argument Heiser engaged with. The form of dismissal extended to the documentary record. Mainstream television documentaries on Mesopotamia, including the BBC's coverage of the Babylonian collections at the British Museum and the Smithsonian Channel's coverage of the Library of Ashurbanipal, have presented the Enuma Elish as religious literature without mentioning the alternative reading. When the alternative reading is mentioned in documentaries, it is typically presented in a separate program framed as speculation, accompanied by music and graphics that signal to the viewer that this is entertainment rather than scholarship. Mauro Biglino has experienced the same pattern in the Italian context. His books, published from approximately 2010 onward by the Italian publisher Uno Editori and others, have sold widely in Italy. They have been the subject of full-length television interviews on Italian commercial broadcasters. They have not been engaged with by the academic biblical scholarship community in Italy. The form of the response, when it has come, been characterization. Biglino is described as a former translator rather than as a current scholar. His arguments are described as sensationalist. The specific claim that certain Hebrew terms in the Genesis text are plural and refer to physical beings is not addressed line by line in any peer-reviewed Hebrew journal that we have been able to identify. The acoustic researchers, working on the resonance properties of ancient ritual spaces, have fared slightly better. Their work is published in peer-reviewed venues, particularly in the proceedings of music acoustic symposia. The measurements are not disputed, but the connection between the acoustic measurements and the textual record. The suggestion that the chambers and the texts may be describing parts of a single coherent practice has not been made in the mainstream literature. The acoustic work and the textual work proceed in parallel, separate disciplinary communities, without integration. The asymmetry of the situation is what the alternative researchers point to. The alternative reading has been advanced in print, in book-length argument, across multiple decades. Mainstream response has been characterization rather than refutation. Refutation requires engaging with a specific claim. Characterization requires only labeling the person who made the claim. Characterization is cheaper. It is also, the alternative readers argue, intellectually inadequate. There is a parallel here worth noting. The Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb has, over the past several years, published peer-reviewed work, arguing that the interstellar object Oumuamua, which passed through the inner solar system in 2017, displayed characteristics inconsistent with known natural origins and consistent with an artificial origin. Loeb's claim has been controversial. His academic peers have characterized his work as sensationalist. They have not, in most cases, engaged with the specific anomalies he identifies. Pattern. Credentialed researcher makes specific claim. Mainstream community characterizes rather than refutes. Recurs across disciplines, wherever the claim implies that the established framework is incomplete. The point is not that Loeb is right, or that Sitchin is right, Biglino is right. The point is that the form of the academic response, characterization rather than engagement, does not by itself constitute refutation. The reader who comes to these arguments fresh, who reads the books and the papers without prior commitment will notice that the response has been thin. They will notice that the specific claim has not been addressed, and they will reasonably ask why. The likely answer, when one looks at the sociology of academic disciplines, is that engagement with fringe claims carries professional cost. Tenured Sumerologist who publishes a paper engaging seriously with Sitchin's reading of MU runs the risk of being characterized, in turn taking Sitchin seriously. That characterization in the academic ecosystem can be career-limiting. The rational individual response is silence. Collective consequence of many rational individual silences is the absence of refutation. This is not a conspiracy. It is not coordinated. It is the natural behaviour of a credentialed community under conditions where engagement with low-status claims is professionally costly and silence professionally safe. The Mesopotamian texts have been sitting in the British Museum since the 1850s. The alternative readings have been in print since 1976. The acoustic measurements of ancient ritual spaces have been published since the late 1990s and early 2000s. Nothing about the situation requires conspiracy. Everything about the situation is consistent with normal academic incentives. What it produces, however, body of unrefuted alternative work that the mainstream treats as refuted. The audience that engages with this material, viewers like you, pause and check the sources and ask the questions that the documentaries do not ask. Is a serious audience. Professional community has not done its work on these texts. The audience has noticed. There is no satisfaction in this observation. There is no triumphalism. The alternative reading may, in the end, prove substantially wrong. It may prove that the three syllables in, mu, bimi are exactly what mainstream philology says they are. Honorific grammatical category, theological concept, and that the acoustic resonance of ancient chambers is unrelated to the textual record of recited syllables. The case is unresolved precisely because the integrative work has not been done. The case will remain unresolved until someone with the relevant credentials in Assyriology, in acoustics, and in cognitive neuroscience does the work that has not been done. In the meantime, the texts are where they have been. The Enuma Elish tablets are in room 55 of the British Museum. The Maklu tablets are in the same collection. Pyramid texts of Yunus are at Saqqara. The Hypogeum is on Malta. The Vedic mantras are recited daily in temples across the Indian subcontinent. The case is available to any researcher who wants to do the integrative work that the mainstream community has not done. The question is still open. It has been open for a long time. To understand the texts in their fullness, we need to spend some time inside the world that produced them. Mesopotamian plain in the late 3rd millennium BCE was a world unlike anything the modern visitor would recognize. The two great rivers, Tigris and the Euphrates, ran across a flat alluvial land that flooded annually. The flooding was unpredictable. Bad year of flood could destroy a city. A good year could leave a deposit of silt that supported agriculture for the following season. The Sumerians, the founding people of this region, built their cities on artificial mounds that rose above the flood plain. Mounds were called tells, and the tells of southern Iraq still stand today, visible from satellite imagery, marking the locations of cities that have been buried for thousands of years. The greatest of the Sumerian cities was Uruk, located in what is now the Muthanna Governorate of southern Iraq, approximately 250 kilometers south of Baghdad. Uruk at its height, around 3000 BCE, covered approximately 6 square kilometers and housed perhaps 50,000 to 80,000 people. It was the largest city on Earth at the time. Its central temple complex, the Inanna precinct dedicated to the goddess Inanna, contained ziggurats, courtyards, storage facilities, and the scribal schools where the cuneiform writing system was developed and taught. The scribal schools, called Iduba, taught generations of scribes the technical literacy required to record administrative transactions, legal proceedings, astronomical observations, and the literary texts that we still read today. The Sumerian language was unrelated to any modern language family. It was an isolate. It was spoken in southern Mesopotamia until approximately 2000 BCE, when it was gradually replaced as a spoken language by Akkadian, the Semitic language of the rising Babylonian and Assyrian powers. Sumerian continued, however, as a written and ritual language for another 2,000 years. Long after no one spoke Sumerian at home, the scribes of Babylon and Assyria continued to copy Sumerian texts, learn the language as a sacred tongue, produce bilingual editions in which the Akkadian translations was written alongside the Sumerian original. The relationship between Sumerian and Akkadian in the Mesopotamian world is comparable to the relationship between Latin and the Romance vernaculars, medieval Europe. The older language carried prestige and ritual authority. Long after it had ceased to be spoken in daily life, 3 syllables that concern us, N, Mi, are Sumerian. They were preserved with their phonological values intact in the Akkadian texts that came later. When the Babylonians and scribes wrote out the names of Marduk in the Enuma Elish, they wrote them in cuneiform signs that preserved the Sumerian pronunciation. The Akkadian gloss followed. The Sumerian core remained. This matters, because the Sumerian language has a particular feature relevant to our question. Sumerian is heavily monosyllabic. Very large number of Sumerian root words are one syllable. The meanings are carried by the syllable itself, modified by grammatical particles that follow. This means that in Sumerian, the syllable carries semantic weight in a way that it does not in most languages. A Sumerian speaker, hearing a syllable, was hearing a word. The line between sound and meaning was tighter in Sumerian than it is in most modern languages. The Sumerian word en, written with a particular cuneiform sign, means Lord. It was used as the title of senior priests and senior deities. High priest of Inanna at Uruk was called the Ian of Inanna. The word also carried, in certain contexts, the connotation of incantation, authoritative speech. The Standard Sumerian Dictionary, the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, maintained at the University of Pennsylvania, lists multiple shades of meaning for N, all clustering around the concept of authoritative speech by a senior figure. The Sumerian word mu means name, or word, or that which is named. It also means year, because Sumerian years were named after significant events. The word appears in personal names. For example, the divine name of the moon god, Nana Suan, was sometimes invoked as Nana Mu, the named Nana. The word also appears in technical contexts in the literature of kingship, where the giving of a mu to a king was an act that conferred royal authority. To give a king a mu was to install him. The Sumerian word me is the most theologically charged of the 3. The me in Sumerian theology were the divine ordinances by which the cosmos was structured. There were said to be 100 or so me, each one a specific function or principle: the me of kingship, the me of priesthood, the me of music, the me of warfare, and so on. The myth called Inanna and Enki describes the goddess Inanna travelling from Uruk to Eridu, the city of the wisdom god Enki, bringing back the me by ship. The myth is presented as a heist. Inanna gets Enki drunk and persuades him to give her the me. She loads them onto her boat and sails back to Uruk, before Enki sobers up and changes his mind. The story is preserved on multiple tablets, the most complete version, held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Point is that the Sumerians thought of the me as transferable objects. They could be physically moved, they could be loaded onto a boat, they could be stolen. This is unusual for a theological abstraction. The Greek logos cannot be loaded onto a boat, The Hebrew Devar cannot be stolen and sailed across the Persian Gulf. The Sumerian me could. This is what the alternative readers point to. The Sumerians did not seem to be describing an abstraction. They seemed to be describing a thing. The texts are old, the texts are concrete. The scribes were not given to metaphor in the way later Greek and Roman writers were. Sumerian literary style is dense, paratactic, and concrete. When the Sumerian text says that Inanna loaded the me onto her boat, the most direct reading is that the scribe meant Inanna loaded the me onto her boat. The metaphorical reading is something the modern translator imposes because the literal reading is unfamiliar. The alternative readers ask, gently, what would happen if we resisted the imposition and read the text as it appears to be written? This is the world the Enuma Elish came from, a world in which the syllable carried weight, in which the spoken word installed a king, in which the divine ordinances could be physically transferred, in which the priest in the inner chamber of the temple uttered specific syllables in specific order, and the text described what happened next. Let us look at one of the priests directly. The cuneiform record preserves the names of dozens of senior temple officials across the centuries of Mesopotamian civilization. One of them, Hedionah, was the daughter of the Akkadian king, Sargon the Great. Sargon reigned from approximately 2334 BCE to 2279 BCE, founding the Akkadian Empire, which was the first multi-ethnic empire in recorded history. Enheduanna, his daughter, was appointed by him to the position of high priestess, the Een, of the moon god Nanna at the city of She held this position for several decades. She wrote a series of hymns, the most famous of which is the Exaltation of Inanna, which has been preserved on multiple tablets and translated into modern languages. Enheduanna is the earliest named author whose works survive in human history. She lived approximately 1,700 years before Homer. Hymns are sophisticated, intricate compositions in Sumerian, addressed to the goddess Inanna and intended for ritual recitation in the temple. They were performed by trained voices. They were composed for acoustic effect. Enheduanna, writing at the founding of the Akkadian Empire, was a master of the technical practice of ritual sound. Her hymns are not vague. They specify pitch, repetition, particular syllables to be emphasized. The biography of Enheduanna is reconstructible in remarkable detail. We know she was exiled from during a political crisis in the reign of her nephew, the king Naram-Sin. We know she returned. We know the disc that depicts her, the Enheduanna disc, was excavated by Leonard Woolley at in the 1920s and is now held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The disc shows her standing in priestly robes before an altar, conducting a libation ceremony. The image is one of the earliest portraits of a named individual in human history. The point of dwelling on Enheduanna is this: the Sumerian and Akkadian priestly tradition was not a tradition of vague mystics making up words as they went along. It was a sophisticated technical tradition with named practitioners, written manuals, preserved texts, and centuries of accumulated expertise. Recitations described in the Enuma Elish were performed by people trained in this tradition. They knew what they were doing, when they recited the 3 syllables associated with the regulation of the human creature, performing a technique that had been refined across many generations. Let me pause here. The texts are real. The priestess was real. The disc is in Philadelphia. The cosmology that the Mesopotamian priesthood operated within was as detailed as their phonology. The Sumerian and Akkadian astronomers were the most sophisticated observational astronomers of the ancient world, tracked the planets. They distinguished 5 visible planets and named them, and they kept records of planetary positions over centuries. The astronomical diaries from Babylon, fragments of which are held at the British Museum, span the period from approximately 750 BCE to approximately 60 BCE. They are the longest continuous record of astronomical observations from any pre-modern culture. They are precise. They distinguish between morning and evening, appearances of Venus. They record the positions of the planets against the fixed stars. They note eclipses with timing that modern astronomy can verify to within minutes. The Mesopotamian astronomers believed that the heavens and the human body were linked. The texts describe correspondences between the 7 visible celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, 5 visible planets, and the 7 openings of the human head: 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, and the mouth. The mouth, the 7th and final opening, was associated with Mercury, the swiftest of the planets, the messenger. The mouth was the organ from which the operational syllables issued. This is not modern overinterpretation. It is in the texts, the medical texts that we mentioned earlier. The Saggig diagnostic series integrate phonology with astronomy, with anatomy, patient with a particular symptom, observed at a particular astronomical conjunction, prescribed a particular syllable to be uttered over a particular body location. The texts are detailed. They were copied and recopied across centuries. They were used. The Mesopotamian physicians were not casual about their materials. The world these physicians and priests operated in was a world structured by visible certainties. The stars rose and set with predictable regularity. The rivers flooded with seasonal regularity. The crops grew or failed according to the management of irrigation. The kings rose and fell. The temples persisted. Across all of this, the texts persisted. The clay tablets, baked hard or sometimes only sun-dried, accumulated in the temple archives, were copied by generations of scribes, and were carried, when cities were destroyed, to new centres where they could be preserved. The library of Ashurbanipal, which is the source of the most complete copies of the Enuma Elish, the Maklu series, and many of the medical texts we have discussed, was assembled in the 7th century BCE at Nineveh by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal was unusual among Mesopotamian kings in that he was personally literate in cuneiform. He had been trained as a scribe in his youth before being elevated to the throne. He took a personal interest in the assembly of his library. He sent scribes throughout the territories of his empire to find and copy texts. The library at its height held tens of thousands of tablets. When Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BCE by a coalition of Medes and Babylonians, the library was buried under collapsed walls. Fire that destroyed the city baked the clay tablets harder, paradoxically preserving many of them. They sat in the ruined mound for approximately 2,500 years before Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam began digging in the 1840s. The tablets that emerged from those excavations are the foundation of our knowledge of Mesopotamian literature. They are the foundation of our reading of the Enuma Elish, the Gilgamesh epic, the Atrahasis epic, and the entire ritual and medical corpus. They are also the foundation, although mainstream scholarship has not framed it this way, of any serious case for the alternative reading. Without the tablets, the alternative reading has nothing to work with. With the tablets, the alternative reading has a body of text that says, in detail, what the priests of Mesopotamia were doing with the operational syllables of the older Sumerian tradition. The tablets are held in the British Museum, principally in room 55, but also in storage facilities not on public display. The total number of tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal in the British Museum's collection is approximately 30,000, which only a portion have been fully translated. The remainder sit in drawers awaiting attention. British Museum's online catalogue allows researchers to search the collection. The texts that have been translated are published. The texts that have not been translated are awaiting translators. This is the situation. A vast, partially translated, fully catalogued textual corpus sitting in a museum in central London, accessible to any researcher with the relevant linguistic training, containing a body of explicit description of phonological practice, as it was understood by the priesthoods of the ancient Near East. The alternative readers have done what they can with the portion that has been translated. The portion that has not been translated remains. What is in those drawers we do not know, because we have not yet read them. What we do know is what the translated portion says. 3. We know the contexts in which they were uttered. We know the chambers in which they were uttered. 2. We know the effects the texts attribute to them. We know the medical contexts in which they were prescribed. We know the anatomical locations on the patient's body over which they were spoken. We know the number of repetitions. We know the duration. We know, in short, a great deal more than the mainstream documentaries on Mesopotamia have communicated to the general audience. The audience, in turn, when they encounter this material, when they pause the documentary and Google the texts, when they read Sitchin or Biglino, when they find their way to the acoustic studies of the Hypogeum, recognizes the gap. They recognize that there is a story that the mainstream presentation has left out. Not a wild story. A specific story. A story about syllables, chambers, and the human nervous system. A story that the texts themselves told quite directly, and that the modern interpretation has muted. What the alternative readers ask of the audience is not credulity. It is not belief in any particular hypothesis. It is attention to what the texts actually say. Attention to what the chambers were measurably built to do. Attention to what the medical texts actually prescribed. Attention to the specific overlap between the textual record and the architectural record, the modern acoustic studies. The attention, when given, produces its own conclusions. The alternative readers do not need to tell the audience what to conclude. They need only point at the material. The material does the work. The clearest parallel from outside the Mesopotamian tradition is the Vedic tradition of the Indian subcontinent, which we touched on earlier, and which deserves fuller treatment here. The Vedic corpus is enormous. It includes 4 primary collections: the Rig Veda, the Samaveda, the Yajurveda, and the Atharva Veda, together with associated theological and ritual texts including the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and the Upanishads. Total corpus runs to hundreds of thousands of verses. It was preserved orally across approximately 3,000 years before being committed to writing in the medieval period, and the oral tradition continues today in the recitation schools of South India. The Samaveda is the collection most directly relevant to our question. The Samaveda is, in essence, the Rig Veda set to ritual chant. Purpose is the systematic transmission of the precise melodic and phonological patterns by which the Vedic hymns must be recited. Text is annotated with pitch markers, breathing instructions, and indications of the duration of each syllable. The recitation tradition that descends from the Samaveda preserves these markers with extraordinary precision. Samavedic chant, performed by a trained Brahmin priest in Tamil Nadu, in the present year reproduces, to a degree that has been verified by acoustic analysis, the precise melodic structure of the chant as it was performed 2,000 or more years ago. This is a phonological fidelity that the Mesopotamian tradition cannot match, because the Mesopotamian ritual tradition was lost with the collapse of cuneiform literacy in the early centuries of the Common Era. The Vedic tradition, by contrast, has been maintained continuously. The trained Brahmin reciter is, in effect, living archive of a ritual practice that began in the 2nd millennium BCE. Biya mantras within this tradition are the elements most relevant to the question of operational sound. A Biya mantra is a single seed syllable treated by the tradition as the phonological essence of a particular deity, principle, or force. The most widely known Biya is Om, also written as AUM. The syllable is composed of three sounds, A, U, and M, that together produce a specific acoustic envelope when uttered correctly. The Mandukya Upanishad, an Upanishadic text dated by mainstream scholarship to approximately 500 BCE, contains a detailed phonological analysis of Om. The text describes the three sounds, their physical production, their effects on the body of the reciter, and their cosmological significance. The parallel with the Mesopotamian case is not exact, but it is close. Both traditions, a small set of syllables is treated as carrying operational weight. In both traditions, the syllables are associated with specific deities and specific powers. In both traditions, the recitation is performed in dedicated ritual spaces under the supervision of trained specialists. And in both traditions, texts describe the recitation as producing measurable effects on the body of the listener. The Vedic tradition is geographically and linguistically remote from the Mesopotamian tradition. Sanskrit and Sumerian are unrelated languages. The Vedic peoples and the Sumerian peoples occupied different river valleys, in different climatic zones, with different cultivated crops, different domesticated animals, and different material cultures. The two traditions were not in regular contact. Presence of a parallel theology of operational sound in two unrelated traditions is, for the alternative readers, piece of evidence that the underlying observation may be real. Two unrelated peoples, both noticing that certain syllables produce certain effects, both developing ritual traditions around those syllables, and both preserving the resulting practices across thousands of years. The Japanese tradition of kotodama, literally word spirit, is a third parallel. Kotodama is the concept that certain Japanese words and syllables carry inherent power. Distinct from their semantic meaning, concept is ancient in Japan and is attested in the Manyoshu, the oldest collection of Japanese poetry compiled in approximately the 8th century CE. The Manyoshu is held in multiple manuscript copies, oldest of which is in the collection of the Imperial Household Agency in Tokyo. The concept of kotodama is older than the Manyoshu and was carried into Shinto ritual, where it remains a living practice. Shinto priests at major shrines, including the Grand Shrine of Ise, recite Norito, formal ritual prayers, that are believed to operate through the inherent power of the spoken syllable, not merely through the meaning conveyed. The geographic distance between Japan and Mesopotamia is approximately 9,000 kilometers. The linguistic distance is total. Japanese is a language isolate, with the closest relatives being the Ryukyuan languages of Okinawa. The cultural distance is total. The Japanese ritual tradition developed independently of any Mesopotamian or Vedic influence in the period when its core concepts were forming. Presence of kotodama as a coherent tradition in Japan, parallel to the Biya mantra tradition in India and the operational syllable tradition in Mesopotamia, suggests that the underlying observation about the power of phonologically precise speech is one that multiple unrelated cultures have made. The conventional explanation for these parallels is the comparative religion explanation. Ritual specialists everywhere, the explanation runs, develop traditions around the special power of speech, because speech is humanly powerful, and the priesthoods of all cultures naturally elaborate this fact into theology. This is the diffusion or coincidence or common human cognition framework that comparative religion routinely uses. The explanation is not wrong. It accounts for the general fact that many cultures elaborate phonological power. What it does not account for, the alternative readers argue, is the specific convergence. The Mesopotamian texts specify 3 syllables, Vedic tradition specifies a small set of biyas. The Japanese tradition specifies particular Norito formulas. The Egyptian tradition, pyramid texts, specifies particular hika utterances. In each case, the tradition is not vague about the number or the identity of the operationally significant syllables. It is specific, and the specificity is what requires explanation. A general tendency to elaborate phonological power explains the existence of such traditions. It does not explain why the traditions converge on particular syllables and particular acoustic features. The Yoruba tradition of West Africa is a fourth parallel. The Yoruba Ifa divination system, which is preserved in an oral corpus of approximately 256 major texts called Odu, includes specific incantations called oriki that are recited at points of divinatory passage. The oriki are treated in the Yoruba theological tradition as operative sound. The Babalawo, the Ifa priest, learns the oriki through long apprenticeship and is expected to recite them with phonological precision. The tradition is still living, practiced in Nigeria, Benin, and across the African diaspora in Brazil, Cuba, and elsewhere. The published corpus of Odu texts, in versions translated by Wande, Abimbola, and others, runs to multiple volumes available in academic press. The Yoruba tradition is geographically remote from Mesopotamia by approximately 4,000 kilometers across the Sahara. The linguistic distance is total. The independent development of an operational sound tradition in West Africa, alongside the parallel traditions in India, Japan, and Mesopotamia, deepens the pattern. The pattern is the cross-cultural confirmation that the alternative readers invoke. Four unrelated traditions, all preserving the same general principle, all specifying particular syllables and particular ritual contexts. Mainstream explanation, common human cognition elaborated into religion, accounts for the general fact but not for the specific convergence. The alternative explanation, that the cultures were independently noticing a real phenomenon, accounts for the specific convergence but requires the acceptance of a claim about acoustic effect that the mainstream academic community has not credited. The question, again, one of evidence and engagement. The evidence is in the texts, in the recitation practices that survive, in the acoustic measurements of ritual spaces. The engagement by the mainstream community has been minimal. The alternative readers continue to point at the material. The material continues to await the integrative study that has not been done. The texts of Mesopotamia, the chants of India, the Norito of Japan, the Oriki of West Africa. These are not hidden documents. They are open, host. The question of what they collectively suggest about the relationship between phonologically precise speech and the human nervous system remains. Sitchin first framed it in 1976, an open question. The strongest objection to the alternative reading is not the dismissive characterization that mainstream Assyriology has typically offered. The strongest objection is more subtle and deserves to be taken seriously. The serious objection runs as follows. The alternative reading takes the descriptive language of the Mesopotamian texts at face value. The text says that Marduk, by the utterance mu, commands the breath of the human. The alternative reading treats this as a literal claim about acoustic effect on respiration. The entire genre of Mesopotamian theological literature is constructed in this idiom. The texts say that Marduk created the heavens. The alternative reading does not, presumably, claim that Marduk literally constructed the dome of the sky. Texts say that Tiamat was a primordial saltwater dragon who gave birth to monsters. The alternative reading does not claim that primordial saltwater dragons existed. The genre is theological. It speaks in a register where every divine action is described as a concrete event. To take selectively from this register, To treat the cosmological assertions as theology and the phonological assertions as proto-science is to apply a hermeneutic inconsistently. This is a serious objection. It is the objection that any honest engagement with the alternative reading must address. The most direct response is that selective reading of a complex ancient text is unavoidable. The Bible is read selectively. Homer is read selectively. The Vedas are read selectively. The question is not whether to read selectively, but whether the selections one makes are principled. The alternative reading argues that the phonological passages, unlike the cosmological passages, are accompanied by specific procedural detail that suggests practical knowledge. Texts do not give detailed procedures for constructing a dome of the sky. The texts do give detailed procedures for reciting particular syllables in particular contexts for particular outcomes. The detail itself is the marker of practical content as distinct from mythological framing. The objection can be pressed further. The medical texts, the Sargig, and the therapeutic corpora also include procedures that modern medicine would regard as ineffective. They prescribe particular materia medica, specific herbs, specific minerals, specific animal parts, for specific conditions. Many of these prescriptions are, by modern pharmacological understanding, useless. The detail of the prescription does not, by itself, establish efficacy. A culture can be detailed about procedures that do not work. The alternative reader cannot use the mere presence of phonological detail as evidence that the phonological procedures worked. This is fair. The alternative reading cannot claim that the procedures worked simply because they were detailed. The narrower claim that survives the objection is this. The detail establishes that the ancient priesthood believed the procedures had specific operational content. The detail does not establish that the procedures had the content they were believed to have. Whether the syllables actually modulated the listener's nervous system is an empirical question that the texts cannot answer. Texts can only tell us that the ancient practitioners believed the syllables did so, and treated their phonological practice as a technical discipline. The further question, whether modern acoustic research provides any independent support for the belief, is where the integrative study not been done. The hypogeum measurements suggest that ancient ritual spaces had acoustic properties consistent with the text's descriptions. They do not prove that the syllables produced the effects the texts attributed to them. The case is, in a strict sense, unresolved. The honest summary, therefore, is that the alternative reading proposes a hypothesis that the available evidence is consistent with but does not establish. The mainstream reading proposes an interpretation that the available evidence is also consistent with. Between the two, the choice currently rests on prior commitments. The reader who is inclined to take ancient texts at their descriptive word will lean toward the alternative reading. The reader who is inclined to apply a uniform mythological hermeneutic to the entire corpus will lean toward the mainstream reading. The integrative empirical work that could move the question forward, careful acoustic measurement of the relevant ritual spaces, careful neurological measurement of human responses to the relevant syllables, careful philological work on the procedural texts, has not yet been done in a coordinated way. Until it has been done, the question remains genuinely open. If the alternative reading is substantially correct, the consequences for our understanding of the ancient world are not small. Conventional histories of the rise of behavioral science place its origins in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Figures like Wilhelm Wundt, founding the first experimental psychology laboratory at Leipzig in 1879, the alternative reading would push the practical exploration of these questions back by approximately 3,500 years, and would relocate it from the German universities of the late 19th century to the temple complexes of the ancient Near East, would require revisions to the standard biographies of figures we thought we understood. Enheduanna would emerge not only as the earliest named author in history, but as a practitioner of a sophisticated technical discipline of which the modern world has only fragments. The priests of Babylon would emerge not as the credulous servants of mythological deities, but as the maintainers of a body of operational knowledge that survived the collapse of their civilization in fragmentary textual form. It would change how we read the parallel traditions. The Vedic Biyas, the Egyptian Heka, the Japanese Kotodama, the Yoruba Oriki would all appear as the surviving fragments of what was at one time more widely distributed body of practical understanding about the human response to phonologically structured sound. Traditions would still be traditions. But they would be traditions about something. It would leave many other questions still open. We would still not know whether the Anunnaki of the Sumerian texts were anything other than the Sumerian gods, as the Sumerian people understood them. We would still not know what the priests of Babylon believed about the origins of their phonological knowledge, still not know whether the knowledge was complete, or, as the texts sometimes suggest, the surviving fragment of something older that had already been mostly lost. Question. The question would simply have been opened in a way that the mainstream reading has not yet allowed. The Enuma Elish tablets are in room 55 of the British Museum. They have been there since Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam shipped them from ruined mound of Nineveh in the 1850s. The Maklu series is in the same collection. The medical texts are in the same collection. The translations are published. The catalogue is open. Zecharia Sitchin has made his argument in print between 1976 and 2007. Mauro Biglino has made his argument in print from 2010 onward. Acoustic measurements of the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum on Malta are in peer-reviewed proceedings. None of this is hidden. What the priests of Babylon recited inside the inner chamber of the Esagila, and what the three syllables en, mu, me, were understood to do to the breath and the mind of the listener is still open, has been open since the tablets were first dug out of the ground in the 1850s. The texts have not been refuted. The integrative work has not been done. It is still open now.